If you walk into a restaurant and order one beer, you might get this or this. And who knows what brand of beer it would be. Just asking for one of anything is ambiguous. Similarly, we need precision in photography, and that's what color management is all about. RGB pixels are just recorded as numbers from 0 to 255, but an ICC profile tells Photoshop exactly how much color each of those numbers stands for. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to use the color settings in Photoshop to make sure you get the color that you want. By the time you open your image in Photoshop, you've already committed to a profile, and in this case, I have ProPhoto RGB. That's what I sent it over to Photoshop from Lightroom as. I could have chosen Adobe RGB, which is a great choice, or sRGB, which is not a good choice for your working file because it's a much more limited color set. Regardless, this video is really not about that starting point. Instead, what we're going to look at is Edit, Color Settings, these options here. And what these options are about is not so much that starting point as making sure you get a warning if you have a bad starting point, and more importantly, helping to make sure that as you evolve your color, as you make changes to your image when you're working on it, that color stays as consistent as possible. So this is really all about making sure that things continue to look good after you've made this initial choice here. Now we're going to come back and take a closer look at all these options in a moment. But I want to create a couple of things for us to compare, and then we'll come back to this. So let's just cancel out of this. And I do want to note that if you're working with Lumenzia, you go to the top right option here for the menu, go to Utilities, and if you just click on this Optimize Photoshop button, it's going to automatically set pretty much all the settings we're going to talk about here. So that's a quick and easy way to do things. But you don't need that. We can do all this manually, and we'll go through all of it in great detail to make sure you know what it means. So let's create some comparisons. We've got this ProPhoto document here, which this is the actual color space, and I've got it named as well. Let's take a look at some other color spaces and we'll be able to compare them. So we'll go up to Image, go to Duplicate, and I'm going to call this one Adobe RGB. Of course, I didn't convert it yet, so it's still in ProPhoto. Let's go up to Edit, Convert to Profile, and here we have the option to convert from our current ProPhoto into a new space, and it is defaulted to sRGB. If you pay really close attention to the sky here, look from before, which is ProPhoto, to after in sRGB, and there's a pretty big change in the color here. It looks more muted and just not as good under sRGB because sRGB is a smaller gamut, and it just simply does not contain a description of these color values. It's outside of the range of its possible set of colors. And so this is just the best that Photoshop can do when it converts that smaller space. Let's go switch over to Adobe RGB. This is the one we want for this particular document. And when I compare this from before and after, there is no difference. So in this case, even though Adobe RGB is not as expansive as ProPhoto, it's more than enough to deal with this particular image. And in general, it's great for most images. So either of these are good choices as you open your document, but I would definitely not start your work with sRGB simply because you're throwing away colors like you've already seen. Now we have these conversion options here, and if you're paying close attention on that previous dialog for edit color settings, these same options are available in both places. The difference is that here, these are the values that will actually be used on this conversion, whereas in the general color settings, those are just the defaults that are going to be used when you're not otherwise asked what you want to use. So let's go ahead and say OK, and I'll just quickly note that we get the engine set to Adobe, which is the best choice. The intent here is relative colorimetric. Perceptual is the other option that gets used a lot for photography, but generally speaking, this would be probably your best bet. And then use black point compensation, which I would always leave on. So these are great settings here, and I'm going to click OK. We've got our output in the Adobe RGB space. Let's make another copy. I'm going to go back to the original. Go up to Image, go to Duplicate again. And this one will be in sRGB. Click OK, and we'll go back to Edit. We'll Convert to Profile, and I'm going to change this over to sRGB. One thing I should have noted before on the intent here, changing this to perceptual, it has no effect when you're working with theoretical working spaces like sRGB and ProPhoto RGB, because these are mathematically defined spaces. They only have a relative colorimetric. They don't actually have a perceptual. Photoshop will let you choose it, but it only matters when you have lookup tables in your profile. And that would be the case with something like a profile of your printer. So you can play with it all day long. You're going to get the same result. So that's why I'm not dwelling on this too much here, really, for this purpose. So let's say OK. And so now we've got our sRGB version. Let's go back to the original, and I want one last copy. We'll go up to Image, Duplicate, and this one I'm simply going to call Untagged, because in this one, what I want to do is remove this profile, and instead of converting it, just remove it entirely and make Photoshop have to guess. So we can do that by going up to Edit, and this time I'm looking for Assign Profile, which I normally have hidden. I have it marked in red because it's really not something you should use on a regular basis. It's designed if you're missing a profile, or in this case, I'm going to use it to remove a profile. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to say, don't color manage this document. And when I do, all of a sudden it looks awful. It is showing ProPhoto here, but when I click OK, now it's saying untagged. And what's going on here is that it hasn't changed the RGB values. If we went pixel by pixel in this image, these pixels are the same as they are in ProPhoto, but now they have new meaning because we're no longer telling it which way to translate those numbers. We previously told it the correct answer, which was ProPhoto. Now it's guessing, and it uses the working RGB space to do that. Let's just quickly compare these side by side. I'm going to go make them all full size here. And so starting with ProPhoto, and we'll just move through the different documents here. As I hover over the sky here, watch the RGB values that are being picked up. So I'm just going to move my mouse here and then not touch it. So this particular pixel is 245, 224, 157, as described in the language of ProPhoto to get this visual color. If I switch over to Adobe RGB by hitting Command Tab, now we're looking at the image in a different color space. It looks visually the same because there is an exact match. However, the RGB values are defined differently, and now the RGB numbers say 255, 226, 163. Jumping ahead to sRGB, visually in this part of the image, it's not an exact match. We're just getting the closest possible match. So of course the numbers are different, but we're seeing 255, 227, 161. And then lastly, in the untagged, of course, it looks totally different. But look at those numbers, 245, 224, 157. When I switch back to ProPhoto, even though it looks different, the RGB numbers are the same. So what's happened here is all the RGB numbers on this image exist in the untagged. We never converted it, so they're the same RGB numbers. However, we've removed Photoshop's understanding of the image, so it no longer knows how those numbers are defined, and it's just guessing, and it's got the wrong guess. So let's take a look at how we deal with that. We go up to Window, Arrange, and choose the 4-up variation here. And I'm just going to move these so that ProPhoto starts up top left. And I'm going to make sure that Adobe is the next thing here, which is somehow throwing me off here. So I just want to get it right. There we go. So I got ProPhoto, Adobe, sRGB, and Untagged. And I'm going to go quickly make them just kind of fit a little bit better. So we see the same area with a good range of color. And of course, these three are in totally different color spaces, but they look nearly identical. I would say the first two, ProPhoto and Adobe RGB, are identical visually, and sRGB is slightly different, though obviously it's kind of hard to tell unless you're doing that before and after. So even within the limitations of sRGB, it's pretty good. In the case of the untagged, though, it looks terrible. And one thing that Photoshop's trying to warn us here, if you look really closely next to the 16 for 16 bits, is this pound sign that only exists on this image. That's Photoshop's way of warning us that we have an unmanaged document when it expects to have color management on. So that's a warning that we need to fix something. Let's go and start to address these things. We'll go up to Edit, Color Settings, and we're back to the same dialog. We're going to start with the left-hand side here, specifically the top left for the working space. What the working space means is when a document is in this color mode, so these are all RGB images, this is what to assume if there's no embedded profile. So in the first three here, they have an embedded profile and that's what's used, and this is ignored. So most of the time, this choice here actually won't affect your image at all. I know a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to figure out the right value, but honestly, it really shouldn't affect your work if you're opening images with embedded profiles, and if you don't have them, you also have this missing profiles ask when opening checked. So if this is on and you open an image like this that's untagged, it's going to pop up with a warning and let you know that, hey, there's something wrong here, and then ask you what to do with it. We'll come back to that in a minute, but let's just take a look at and see what happens if we choose a different option. If we said ProPhoto, that just coincidentally is the correct answer for this particular image. It could have been defined differently, but for this image, that's the right choice. And now it matches everything else. If we had chosen some other space, obviously, anything but the correct color space is just a, roll the dice as to whether you get something that looks horrible or reasonably good. The only right answer in this case is the correct one, which ideally should just be embedded in the file. That's why we use embedded profiles to make sure we get the right answer. But this is just going to save us if something is off, or that's the other place where this can show up here, aside from dealing with these untagged images that have no profile, is if you go up to image mode, and normally this would pop out with a choice of like RGB, lab, all that kind of stuff. If you convert color spaces up here, when you say image mode RGB, you're not saying which RGB. It's going to go back here and say, okay, well, I guess I'll use ProPhoto because that's what the working space is. Whatever you have here is what would be used up for image mode. And for that reason, I would recommend you never use image mode to convert to lab and back. If you're doing that, instead go up to convert to profile, and then you can tell exactly which one you want to convert to. That's going to give you better results than this here. So for the most part, this actually doesn't matter, but I would say that if you're working with a lot of images that don't have a profile, then it might. And the case where you're going to have an untagged image like this is typically going to be something like an image you scanned on a scanner, one you got from a stock agency, or something downloaded from the internet. And in all of those cases, usually the right answer is going to be sRGB. So that's actually a pretty good thing to choose here for your working space, because it'll just prompt you with that option when you open the file. And it's not a bad or dangerous thing to do if you have this ask when opening checked, which is going to prompt you with a warning. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and say okay with these settings. Let's go to this one, and we'll just kind of quickly save this thing. And I'm going to overwrite a previous version I had of it. And so we've saved it, and nothing's popping up right now because the image is still open and it still has the same understanding of this image. But now when I close it, let's go reopen that image. I'm going to go up to File, Open Recent, and choose my untagged image. And now when I do this, now we get this warning. This warning pops up because we had that checkbox in Edit Color Settings to give us this warning that there is no profile. So now it's saying, hey, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue to not have a profile? Do you want to just assume that the working profile sRGB is correct? Or do you know better? And we do know better. We know that ProPhoto RGB is the correct answer. So if we sign that and say, okay, now it opens up in our untagged image, actually now is tagged and it looks correct. Let's go move these back here. And one more time, get the Adobe RGB. Man, these are so hard. If Adobe's watching this, please help make this a little easier to get these aligned. It is really hard to drop that to the right spot. There we go. And I'm going to quickly make these fit again. So this image now, we just assigned it a tag upon import. So if we go back to the color settings, we go up to Edit, Color Settings. Now this time, if we start choosing different values here, it doesn't care because it's not actually untagged anymore. It actually has this ProPhoto tag in the image. We just fixed that problem because we had this missing profiles ask when opening check. So this is a really important one to use, especially if you get those untagged images. The next option here in the working space is you got CMYK. Very few people in photography are going to use CMYK as an image mode at all. Generally shouldn't matter. If you're in there, either use what your printer tells you to use or go with the defaults. Then there's the gray working space. I would also recommend not working in the gray image mode for black and white. RGB is a better choice because it gives you access to all of the capabilities of Photoshop instead of a limited set you get with grayscale. The only benefit of grayscale is smaller files, and I just don't think it's worth it. But there is one place where it matters, and that is in the case of luminosity masks. This affects how your masks are worked on. And while you may read some advice suggesting that you should set it to 1.8 or 2.2 to try and match the working space, that's not how it works. It actually goes by the effective space. So it's the embedded space that's going to matter. And so the correct answer here depends on which image you're working on. And so to do this correctly, you should change it all the time. And Lumenzia will do that for you. I've got a video that I'll link to below here that shows exactly what that's all about and goes through in great detail. Then we have the spot space, which again, very unlikely you're working with the spot color space. If you are, go with the recommendations from your printer. The next block here are these color management policies. You've got them for RGB, CMYK, and gray, where you can choose off, preserve embedded, or convert to working RGB. You definitely should choose preserve embedded profiles. If you set it to off, then what happens is when you open an image, if that image matches the working RGB, it will leave the profile in the document. If it's different, if I open my Adobe RGB image and I have this profile, the working space set to Pro Photo, what it's going to do, it's going to strip out the Adobe RGB. It's not going to fix it, and then the image is going to look wrong. So you definitely want preserve embedded. The other option here where it says convert to working RGB, I would avoid that. There's no value in making a bunch of random conversions of your working space. Open it correct the first time, and then just stick with that until you're ready for your final output. So all of these should say preserve embedded profiles. Then we have the profile mismatches, and these are a little confusing. So profile mismatch, ask when opening. What this means is if you open an image and it has an embedded profile which does not match the RGB profile, it will prompt you and ask you what to do. So if I use that right now and I opened up the Adobe RGB file, it would say, hey, this doesn't match your working space. If I open the sRGB file, it would say, hey, it doesn't match your space. What do you want to do? Do you want to convert it? I would avoid unnecessary conversions. So there's really no value in doing this. It's not warning you about a problem, and it's not giving you anything beneficial. The next one, which has ask when pasting, this one operates a little bit differently. If I were to take something from this image and paste it over here, by default, Photoshop is going to try and convert it and make it look as good as possible. That's what you want. If you check the ask when pasting, what it'll do is it will ask you, hey, do you want to convert it, which is the right answer, or do you want to screw it up by not converting it? I can't think of any reason why you would ever use that choice. So just turn it off and you're going to get the right answer automatically without dealing with the confusion of some pop-up. So this is the only one that I would leave checked here. Then we have these conversion options over here. You've got the engine, which is which algorithm is used. So you've got the option of Adobe or Apple on a Mac. On a PC, you would have Adobe or the Windows version of their color management tool. I would choose Adobe. It's excellent, and you get the same results no matter whether you're on a Mac or a PC. Then you have the intent. And here, again, relative color metric or perceptual are generally speaking the right answers, but the place where this comes into play is when you're not asked. So when you go up to edit, convert to profile, you can specify this. Where this would come into play would be things more like you're copying and pasting between the documents, or you use image mode, which I would recommend you don't do, or something of that nature where you're not prompted, but there's been a color space conversion. So usually it's going to be the copy paste scenario. I would say leave it on relative color metric because most of the time that's going to be the best choice. You can always do a one-off conversion of the image and then do your copy and paste if you want more control, or come in here and change this, but I would just generally leave that there. Then you have use black point compensation. That's going to try and make sure that your shadows look the same. Always leave that on. Use dither is used when you convert from a 16-bit down to an 8-bit image. What it does is 8-bit images can show banding in areas like smooth blue sky. So dithering adds a little bit of noise to try and obscure that. So dithering is generally speaking a good thing to do. If you find that you think the results look a little noisy or something like that, you can turn this off, but I would just leave this on. And then compensate for scene referred profiles, just leave it on. You can ignore it. It's really meant for people who use Photoshop for video work and doesn't have much bearing on anything you're going to do with your photography. The last area here, these advanced controls. This first one, desaturate monitor colors by. The idea here is that you might be working on an image that has colors that are so vibrant they can't be displayed on your screen. And that's really the case with some very punchy images. There might be colors here that I cannot see on this image, even though it's a wide gamut monitor. If I check this, see how it kind of dims the color overall. And so the idea is that you'd be able to see some of those variations in colors that were off the limits of the screen. I would leave this off. It's not precise. I really can't think of a good reason to turn this on. Just work with the soft proofing and other normal ways of editing your image rather than hacky workarounds like this, which is going to deliberately make your color incorrect on the screen in the hopes of seeing something that your screen couldn't display. Then we have these two options here for how colors are blended with something known as gamma, this mathematical term. I would also leave these at their default, but I think it's worth explaining what they do. So let's go ahead and say okay, and let's just close out these extra copies, and we'll just do a quick little comparison here. What's going to happen is when colors are blended, there's going to be an effect. So let's go create a new blank layer, and I'm going to hit B for my brush. Let's go pick a vibrant red like this, make our brush pretty big, and I'm just going to brush like this across the screen. Maybe undo that. Let's do a little bit of softness to it. So go feather that thing out and do that once more. So we've got this red here, and then on top of it, let's create another new layer. And in this one, I'm going to go choose green, really bright green, and I'm going to go across it this way. And what I want to do is zoom in and look at these areas where these colors are blended. Maybe I'll take this green layer and let's take the opacity down a little bit just to see a little bit more what's going on here. You've got this transition from red through the middle to the green. And if I zoom in even closer, watch what happens when we go up to Edit, Color Settings, and let's just get this out of the way here. If we turn on this Blend RGB Colors using Gamma 1, when we do this, you get a totally different result in the blended area here. Now we have from red to yellow to green, which makes sense because when you add red and green, you should get yellow. You shouldn't get something that's darker. And when this is off, which is the default behavior of Photoshop, it is darker. So you might be tempted to say, hey, let's turn this on. RGB colors blended with Gamma 1, they look better. They're more accurate. And that's true. You can zoom back and just kind of see the overall image. You can see it's affecting these blended areas. And as you'd expect, when you're painting, it should get brighter, not darker like the edges do here. And that's just a quirk of decisions that were made a long, long time ago in Photoshop to blend using a gamma other than 1, which is considered colorimetrically correct. So you might think, hey, let's turn this on and use this. However, I would strongly recommend that you do not turn it on. Even though it's technically more accurate and it looks pretty nice here, there are a lot of problems with turning this on. This is a global setting that affects all of the images you work with. So the moment I turn this on, every image I've already created with layers in the past is potentially going to look different when I open it in Photoshop, and that may cause a lot of unwanted problems. The other issue with this is when I save the document, there's not a setting that's saved with the document that covers this. Unlike the ICC profile that you can embed, you can't embed this setting. That would be nice, but you can't. So if I open that image on another computer or send it to a friend, and we did not turn on this same option, then that file is going to look different. So for the sake of being consistent, I would turn this off because I think you're more likely to run into problems than really get a benefit. And unless you're using these really punchy colors like this, you're probably not going to see much of a difference. But I think to be on the safe side, just leave this at the default. I think until we have it at a per document way of setting this, it's just better not to do it. So those are the overall color settings. To learn more about how to work with the gray gamma, be sure to see this next video. We can learn how it will benefit your luminosity masks.